Okay, so today's lecture is more or less self-contained in nature, and I prepared some slides for this. In fact, we will start from some motivating situation from physics, some applied problems, and we will see how the function analysis theory can be applied in such situations. Okay, and we'll be using some of the tools which we already developed in the previous lectures, and but most of the time this will be a self-contained course. So let us begin with the well-known problems. I mean, we will introduce a couple of problems which is very much established. The first one is vibrating string problem. So what is vibrating string problem? So in fact, most of you might have heard about this during your graduate course. This is a problem which in most of the engineering courses which is being discussed. In fact, this problem arises in several different forms at various situations. So to make it simpler, let me explain this in this way. So you consider an elastic string with both ends are tight, and simply pluck it or struck it. We consider the vibrations of this string. So suppose it is a one-dimensional object, and so what about the initial position? So initial position will be described by some function, right? So let us denote it by, say, f of x. So y equal to f of x describes its initial position. And let us consider the string on a unit interval, say 0, 1. And suppose we know the initial velocity also. That means at time t equals 0, the initial velocity is described by some function, say g of x. So these are the initial conditions. I mean, this is the initial position, f of x, and g of x is the initial velocity. Now, here is the modeling purpose. So we need to describe the motion of this string. That means at some point of time, say t, we should know the position. That means we need to know the position of this the function. I mean, what do you call the vibration of the string at the time t and at the position say x. So it's a function of two variables, say y equal to xt, and in general it will be a function of maybe 4 variables, and 3 variables will be for position and 1 variable for time. So let us make the simplest situation of one-dimensional thing. So we need to understand the function y equal to y of xt. Okay, and due to certain physical reasoning, like Newton's second law of motion, what we do, it's a derivation of this equation. Okay, so that is something you might have done during your graduation, or even though if you did not do, that is fine. I mean, it is not a difficult thing to do. We will make use of the physical information, whatever is given to us, and apply certain physical laws. Here we use Newton's second law of motion, and end up with certain equations. So in this situation, we will end up with the wave equation. So this is the wave equation. That means the second derivative of y. So y equal to y of xt is the function which we need to determine. It will satisfy this second order differential equation. Ytt is equal to a square into yxs, where a is a fixed constant. And what are the initial conditions? For example, at the endpoints, say 0 and 1 are the endpoints. At 0 and 1, there won't be any vibration, right? Because those two ends are fixed. They are fixed. So we don't expect any vibration there. So, but there are situations where you fix only one end and let it vibrate. Then at one point you will have 0, and other point you will have the maximum value. That means the derivative will be 0. So there are several situations arises. So the boundary conditions and initial conditions come from the physical reason, physical situation. Okay. So here y0t and y1t equals 0 because we fixed both ends. Okay. And initial condition we already mentioned that t equals 0, the position is described by f of x, and the velocity is described by g of x. Now, what about the solutions? So we need to find a solution. That means What do you mean by a solution? A function y of xt which satisfies these three conditions. The equation should satisfy this equation, it should satisfy the boundary conditions, and it should satisfy the initial conditions. So there are several methods to compute the solution, and there are several ways to describe the solution and describe the physical nature of the solution and so on. Now, let us not go into that aspect, but what we can easily observe is this. If you consider this function y of xt equal to sine k pi x into sine a cap pi t, and y of xt equal to sine into cos, in this way, these two functions will satisfy the wave equation and the boundary conditions also. I mean, it will satisfy this. It is a simple verification, and it will also satisfy this boundary condition. Now, whether it satisfies the initial conditions, the initial conditions are satisfied only for a special choice of fn, because, for example, if you put here t equal to 0, you will end up with 0 here. And if you look at the derivative, so yeah, so that means this is satisfied f equal to 0 only. And if you take derivative, then also you will have certain restriction. So here, if you put t equal to 0, you will end up with sine k pi x. So initial conditions are satisfied only for some special choice of fng. Okay. Now, another observation, because of the homogeneity nature of this problem, any finite linear combination of these functions will again a solution to this problem. That means y of xt equal to this finite linear combination. This is finite sum. So this is a finite sum. So this finite linear combination will also become a solution to this problem. Okay. So this will also satisfy wave equation as well as the boundary conditions. Now the question: what happens if we consider the infinite linear combinations? So yesterday, when we introduced shorter basis, and at several point of time, we realized that there are possibilities to consider infinite linear combination of functions or vectors and so on. So our question is, for finite linear combination, you know it's a solution for some special choice of fng. So what happens if you consider infinite linear combinations? Or do they make sense? If you take an infinite linear combination, so some convergence issues will come and so on. So this is the problem. This is the question. Okay. Let me pose this question in this way and move to the next problem, the well-known heat conduction problem. Now it's again a physical situation. Imagine a thin plate of some material, and you apply heat on the boundary. So when you apply heat, so Newton's law of cooling will tell you that heat always, and that is our simple observation. I mean, heat will flow always from the point at lower temperature, point at higher temperature to point at lower temperature. That is the Newton's law of cooling. That is a simple observation. Now you assume that uxy denote the temperature at the point xy. Okay, I mean, you have a thin plate and temperature at an arbitrary point inside that. Okay. Using some experimental facts and again Newton's law of cooling, heat conduction at steady state. Steady state is important. That means after a certain stage it will attain the steady state where things will not depend on t, the time. So it will be independent of the time. So if it is not steady state, some on the right hand side you will have something which depends on t will come. So some derivative with respect to t and so on. So what we obtain is the Laplace equation. So the function which represents the temperature at a particular point will satisfy the Laplace equation, dou square u by dou x square plus dou square u by dou y square equals 0. And if you write it in the polar form, it will have this form, dou square u by dou r square plus 1 by r and dou u by dou r plus 1 by r square and dou square u by dou theta square equals 0. So if you are considering the plate to be something like a unit disk, and if the heat flow at the boundary is given, so that means we apply heat on the boundary and the amount of heat we apply on the boundary is known to us. So then what happens? See, u r theta plus 2 pi equal to u r theta. That is evident because these 2 points, r theta plus 2 pi and r theta represent the same point in the plate. This is an obvious condition. And another thing is that U1 theta. U1 theta means R equal to 1. That means on the unit circle, on the boundary. So suppose on the boundary, the heat flow is given to us. So you know the, so this is usually the situation. You know the heat on the boundary. You need to know the value at an interior point. Okay. Now again, solutions by something called variable separable method or something. One can solve Laplace equation and obtain the solutions to be this one. A r raised to n, a e raised to capital A e raised to in theta plus b e raised to minus in theta, with n is any natural number and others are constants, any constant. So this will actually satisfy the Laplace equation. Okay. So since it satisfies the Laplace equation and Laplace equation is an homogeneous equation, any finite linear combination of this form, so if you write it together, you'll obtain something like this. So any finite linear combination of this form will also satisfy the equation. Now, what happens if we consider boundary conditions? Boundary condition means r goes to 1. So when r goes to 1, this will become this form. So r goes to 1 means this becomes this form. So boundary condition u1 theta is f theta. So f theta should be equal to the finite linear combination like this. So f has a restriction there. It should be a finite linear combination of this. And again, the same question. What happens if we consider the infinite linear combinations? Then we may require f theta should be like this. So what happens is that see, f theta is the amount of heat we applied on the boundary. So it is the boundary condition which we know. So what happens is that things will not be true. I mean, the solutions will not satisfy the, will not fulfill the requirement unless if you have your f arrays in this way for some ans. So the question is, can we write every function f as an infinite linear combination of exponentials or sine and theta and cosine theta? So can we do this? So this is the question. Okay. And this right hand side is actually known as the Fourier series. And the issue is about the convergence of the Fourier series. When you write something like this, what does it make sense, first of all? So the question is for what all functions it will be true and under what kind of convergence and so on. In fact, these two particular problems contributed a lot to the development of classical analysis. Basically what happens, historically, when people dealt with Fourier series, such series, and when this problem arose for the first time in history, in those era, the convergence and the notion of infinity, those things were not there. And mathematics were not started doing in rigorous form. It was, and there was no difference between mathematics, physics, and so on. So what happened that those time people believed that such an expression will always represent a function, and the Fourier series, there is no convergence issue arose that time. But later when people started to do things rigorously, then these convergence issues became a serious problem. And people initially believed that the Fourier series converges for any function. But later people realized that there are counterexamples where the series does not converge. Even for under continuity assumption, it does not make sense, and so on. So what happens is that, so the development, so people from physics knew that this kind of series are useful for them. So there should be some mathematics behind this. But from a rigorous mathematics point of view, this was not making sense. So people realized that the problem is with the mathematics which we have been doing, because that time the existing notion of convergence doesn't suit for the convergence of Fourier series. So we had to develop the notion of convergence in a different way. We had to develop the notion of function itself. So now the question which we can proceed is in several ways. One way is that you impose more assumption on the function f and which makes this convergent, series convergent. Another way is that you relax the notion of convergence, okay? And this contributed to the origination of several notions of convergence and so on. Now, we have already introduced several kind of Banach spaces and so on, and several metrics induced by norms. And each norm represents a particular kind of convergence with respect to that norm. Okay, so why do we require these many examples and these many norms and so on? Because it depends on the notion of convergence. I mean, so for example, if Fourier series does not converge pointwise, so you have to think about whether the Fourier series converges in the LP norm, or are there uniform convergence for some function, and so on. So several such questions arise. So this is the origination. I mean, this is the motivating examples. Now we are moving to, before moving to the core area, let me also mention that this is not the only area where we apply our function analysis tools. There are several. I mean, this list is this is an incomplete list of areas where function analysis is being applied. Signal processing, of course, those who have done a little bit wavelet theory and so on may be familiar with the application of function analysis techniques in signal processing. Data compression issue is also a kind of orthonormal basis issue. Tomographic reconstruction means, so this is just like, I mean, some problems in mining, some mining problems or data mining, or maybe, for example, we know very little information about certain things, certain images, and we have to reconstruct such things. So the tomographic reconstruction is being used. So there also the analysis tools are being applied. Principal component analysis is a very important area where these tools are being used. I mean, nowadays these kind of machine learning and in this kind of areas in artificial intelligence are very much popular. And probability theory, of course, is an area which is inevitable when you do analysis and so on. Now, let me go to the very elementary geometry property. So, okay. So, are there any questions so far? Any questions so far? Any questions? So, if you have any questions, please let me know. Shall I proceed?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, let me begin with a very simple geometric object. So, this is something which you all of you know, the Pythagoras theorem. I mean, so what is Pythagoras theorem? You have s square equal to b square plus h square, where b is this side and h is this height of a right angle triangle. And also, this is the parallelogram law. I mean, the sum of the squares of this diagonals is equal to 2 into sum of the squares of the sides. Okay. I mean, these are some geometric observations, right? But keep in your mind that the geometric observations gives you an algebraic identity like this. Similarly, the geometric observations gives you an algebraic identity like this. That is very important. Now let us look at that. Angle and dot product. I mean, here you need an angle, right? So you are talking about a right angle triangle so that you have this algebraic identity. But where does this, from where this angle comes? So you consider the dot product of two vectors, which is, this is a familiar definition for dot product of A and B. This is AB cos theta, where theta is the angle between A and B. So if you know the angle between two vectors, then you know the dot product. Then you can compute the dot product between them. But you can do the other way also. I mean, suppose you know the dot product. Then what you can do? You can define the angle between them to be this. I mean, you divide by AB and take the cosine inverse of this. So that will give you the angle. So dot product and angle are something which you can use like this. I mean, if you know the dot product, you know the angle. If you know the angle, you know the dot product. Now, one more thing is that regarding dot product, you have another way to compute this. I mean, you can write if A equal to this and B equal to this, then A dot B is A1 B1 plus A2 B2. Remember, this does not make use of any angle. On the right hand side, you only have an algebraic identity. Okay. So without bothering the geometry, you can write the dot product. But we have already seen that if you know the dot product, we can compute the angle. But the right-hand side identity is purely an algebraic identity, which you can extend to higher dimension also, where you don't have any geometry, any angle, or it is difficult to compute the angle and so on. So that is the advantage of this algebraic identity. So therefore, the dot product is something which we are going to generalize to higher dimensional case, so that I can generalize the geometry to the higher dimensional case. Now the complex situation, keep in your mind that A dot A gives you the absolute value square. So in the complex situation, if you need that A dot A to be absolute value of A square, you need to define A dot B to be A1 bar B1 plus A2 bar B2, where A is this end. So you need a conjugate. You need to make use of the conjugate. Otherwise, you will not get this, right? So this is to make sure that you are getting the norm or absolute value from the dot product. So if you are dealing with complex entries, we will be having this definition. Here is a question, an alert. That means typically in functional analysis textbooks, this dot product is defined as A1 B1 bar plus A2 B2 bar. But I am using the conjugate on the first entry. And this is actually the notation used by mathematical physicists. So there is no much difference. It is not much different from the other definition. The only thing is that you'll have linearity in the first variable if you use the other definition, and conjugate linearity in the second variable. But here it will be the other way. That is the only difference. Okay, all other properties will be the same. Let us see examples. Before going to definitions, before going to the general definition, let me look at the example. So Cn, this is something familiar to all of you, the n-tuples of complex numbers. So you define the inner product ZW to be this one, summation Zj bar Wj. So remember, I am giving conjugation on the first variable. Then you can easily see that this function, this definition will satisfy these four properties. What are they? This will be linear in the second variable. That means if you replace the second variable by alpha W1 plus alpha 2, alpha 1 W1 plus alpha 2 W2, then you can take that sum outside. See, alpha 1 into ZW1 plus alpha 2 into ZW2. And this is known as antisymmetry. So ZW, if you replace Z and W, then Z by W, then you will get WZ bar. And ZZ will be always non-negative, and it is 0 only when Z equals 0. And these are some trivial properties you can observe from this definition. Okay. Now the second example, this is the sequence space which we have seen yesterday. This is the set of all sequences, sequence of complex numbers, such that there are only finitely many non-zero elements. Okay. And here also you adapt the same definition, inner product ZW equal to summation Zj bar Wj. But remember that even though it's an infinite sum, there are only finitely many non-zero terms because Z and W are coming from C00. Therefore, there is no convergence issue arise here. So again, the property 1 to 3 is can be easily verified. Now the third one, most important one, L to N. I mean, we have already introduced LP spaces. Here we consider the case when P equal to 2. So Z1, Z2, etc. the sequence of complex numbers with which are square summable. Now here you just extend the definition in the Cn to infinite dimensional setting. Inner product ZW equals summation Zj bar Wj. Now this makes sense because if you put an absolute value here, then you can apply the Helder's inequality which we discussed last couple of days. Then this will be bounded by summation mod Zj square into summation mod Wj square, which is finite because Z and W are coming from L2. Therefore, this is an absolutely summable series. Hence, this convergence of this series is this can be easily verified. So this is the inner product which we define. So all other properties are trivial to observe. Okay. Now we consider x equals C01. This is another example which we considered last days. All continuous functions, real or complex valued continuous functions defined on closed boundary interval 0, 1. Here what we do, we use our Riemann integration. Since f is a continuous function, f and g are continuous functions, f into g, f bar is also continuous, f bar into g is also continuous, hence its Riemann integration makes sense. So remember, so we are just imitating whatever we did in the finite sum or summation case or countable setting. There we were summing up Zj bar Wj. So here we are, instead of sum will be replaced by an integral. That's the only difference. So we have integral 0 to 1 f of t bar g of t. And again, properties are easily verified because of the linearity of the integral and so on. And one property is something which we already proved, discussed in the problem session and so on. So now the third one is L201. We have already discussed LP of E in a general setting. Now we take E to be the closed interval 0, 1 and P equal to 2. Then we have the equivalence class of functions. So what are the elements in L2? Can you tell me what are the elements in L2?
Set of all, equivalent class of two integrable functions.
Yeah. So equivalent class of square integral functions. So, so what happens there also? So here also you can introduce the inner product like this. Inner product fg equal to integral 0 to 1 f bar g. But remember, here we are using the Lebesgue integration. It is not the Riemann integration. So here also the checking of properties are easy because we already established the linearity property of integral. Now another interesting example is M and C. Set of all n by n matrices, complex matrices. Okay, for two matrices A and B, we define inner product AB to be trace of B A star. A star means conjugate transpose. And if you multiply B with A star, you get a matrix. And trace means sum of the diagonal entries. And it's an easy thing for you to verify that this also satisfies the problems. The conditions 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now we have seen several examples, in fact 5 or 6 examples where the same condition is satisfied. Let me make the definition now. An inner product X is a complex vector space. First of all, it should be a vector space with an inner product on it. And what is inner product? Inner product is a function from X to R. Oh, in fact, there is a mistake. It is not from X to R. It is from X cross X to R. Okay, it's a typo here. So it should satisfy. For each fg in X, you need inner product fg. It should satisfy this. It should be linear in the second variable. That is linear in the second variable. Anti-symmetry, or what happens is that if you replace the order of f and g, then you'll have a conjugate here. And inner product ff is always non-negative, and it is 0 only when f equals 0. Okay. Again, we will be considering only complex vector spaces here. We are not interested in the real situation. Okay. Now let me make a notation. Do not confuse with the norm, because I am yet to prove that it is a norm. Still, I will use this notation, norm f equal to ff power 1 by 2. Okay, so let me use it as a notation only. For the timing, I will not, I don't know whether it satisfies all the properties of a norm. But this is just, but keep your similarity with the dot product. You can see that A dot A was mod A square. So A dot A power 1 by 2 means it is mod A. That means absolute value. So you have an intuition that this should be something like an absolute value, which is called a norm. So later we will see that norm, this represents the size of f. That means the norm itself. Now we don't know whether it is a norm, but we are going to prove certain properties of this function. This is the parallelogram. So now, see, we have already seen the parallelogram identity of some geometrical figure, rectangle, parallelogram. So now we are going to see there we used a geometry to obtain that. Here without geometry, we are using it using the, we are proving it using the algebra only. but we have an inner product. We should have an inner product. That inner product will give you a geometry. That's what I'm going to say. Now, this will satisfy this norm f plus g square plus norm f minus g square equal to 2 into norm f square plus norm g. That means if you consider a parallelogram with sides norm f and norm g, sides are, suppose the sides are represented by the vector f and g, and this represents their size, then you can see that the diagonals will be f plus g and f minus g. So this is the sum of the squares of the size of the diagonals, and this is 2 into sum of the squares of the sides. So now, this is what I mentioned here. So now let me prove this. Proof is very easy, because norm f plus g square by definition. So how did we define norm? Norm is defined to be ff power 1 by 2. That means norm f square is inner product ff. So norm f plus g square is inner product f plus g. Now we use the property that it is linear with respect to the second variable. So you fix f plus g there, use linearity in the second variable. So it is f plus g f plus f plus g g. Now let me use linearity in the first variable, but first variable you have conjugate linearity, but addition is preserved. Only scalar multiplication comes, then alpha bar will come outside. Okay. So we get ff plus gf plus fg plus gg. That means this is norm f square, this is norm g square, and this is gf plus fg. That is actually the conjugate z plus z bar form. That means 2 into real part of fg. So by computation you will get this. Norm f plus g square equal to this, norm f minus g square equal to this. Now you sum them, you'll obtain this gets cancelled and 2 into. So that's a simple proof. Okay, this is a parallelogram identity. Now orthogonality. Two vectors are orthogonal if inner product of g equals 0. Recall that in the vector space, where in the vector product, in the dot product, two vectors are orthogonal. When do we have to take perpendicular to each other? Can you tell me? Using the dot product?
Dot product is 0.
Yes, I didn't hear you.
Dot product is 0.
When the dot product is 0, we say that the angle between them will be pi by 2. That means they are perpendicular. So we use that. So we use that here to define that two vectors are orthogonal if f inner product of g is equal to 0. And if you have a collection, arbitrary collection, a family of vectors, we say that it is orthonormal if two distinct vectors are orthogonal to each other and the same vector f alpha should be equal to 1. Okay, so that is denoted by the Dirac delta function like this. Now, Pythagorean theorem. This is a very interesting theorem. Okay, we know if you have right angle triangle, the Pythagoras theorem, which we already mentioned, but that made use of the geometry of that triangle. Now we obtain this exactly same thing in the arbitrary inner product space. Suppose you have f1, f2, f3, etc., fn orthogonal. Okay, orthonormal. That means they are orthogonal to each other and each of them have norm 1. Then we have this identity. This is a very interesting identity. Summation j equal to 1 to n, absolute value of fj g square minus plus norm g minus summation j equal to 1 to n, fj g fj square is equal to norm g square. So how do you prove this? Proof is very easy. What do? You call this quantity g tilde. Whatever is given here, you call it g tilde. And compute norm g tilde square. Norm g tilde square is inner product g tilde, which is by definition g tilde is this. So you replace it here and here. Now remember, you can take this finite sum and this finite sum outside. But the thing is that when you take this sum outside, then there will be a bar because it is conjugate linear. So conjugation will come. And when you take this outside, exactly this linear sum will come outside. But there's a catch. When you take inner product between, so the remaining is the inner product of this one with this one. Okay. So what happens is that use orthonormality. So for example, here f1 and here f2 comes means it is 0. f1 with f3 0. So f1 with f1 will only survive. Okay, and that is 1 due to orthonormality. So the same terms will only contribute to this. Therefore, you obtain summation j equal to 1 to n fjg bar into fjg. That means mod fjg square. So that's what you get here. This is an easy thing. Similarly, you can compute inner product g delta to be the same thing. Okay. Now, what you do? You compute this quantity. What is this? Norm g minus this g tilde square. So by the definition, it is norm g minus inner product g minus g tilde, and you apply the linearity. So it is norm g square plus norm g tilde minus 2 into real part of this. But remember that norm g tilde square and g tilde, they are same. Both of them are same. We have just proved it. So this is something norm g tilde square minus 2 into norm g tilde square, which is minus norm g tilde square, which is this. So this is norm g square minus this quantity. That means this quantity. So we obtained whatever required. So this is a very interesting identity, which we will use later. Okay. Now, remember, the same result will work for as n tends to infinity also. So this tells you that something more. I mean, suppose we remove this fact. This is a non-negative thing, right? This is always non-negative. So we have to add a non-negative quantity to this to obtain norm g square. That means this quantity will be always less than or equal to norm g square. So that is what Bessel's inequality tells you. If f1, f2, etc., fn is orthonormal set and g is any arbitrary element, then this quantity will be always less than norm g square. So that follows from here, right? So we just remove, here means you are removing a non-negative quantity. So you have to add that non-negative quantity to obtain norm g square. So hence this quantity will be less than or equal to this. So that's what Bessel's inequality. This is a very important inequality. But this tells you that this is true for any n. Okay? And if there are infinitely many and you let n tends to infinity, then also it will satisfy because the right hand side is independent of n. But we will come to that. Now, a very important inequality is in the theory of inner product spaces is Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. In fact, some variation of this is something we have already seen, but let me prove it using whatever we did now. So what does it tell you for fn? Okay, is the proof clear? Is that okay so far? Things are okay? Any questions so far?
No, sir.
Yeah. Is that clear to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you start from two vectors in the inner product space, f and g, and look at the absolute value of inner product fg. That will be less than or equal to norm f into norm g. Remember, even though I call it norm f and norm g, it is only notation. I did not prove that it's a norm. Okay. Is that clear to all of you? Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
For the time being, I just use it as a notation only. I call it norm, but I did not prove that it's a norm. What should be a norm? I mean, to define, to call that something a norm, what are the properties to be satisfied? Can you tell me? Can you recall that? Yesterday we did the norm.
Norm x greater than or equal to 0.
Yeah.
Norm x equal to 0 if and only if x equal to 0.
Yeah.
Norm of alpha x എന്ന് പറയുന്ന mod of alpha into norm
Yeah.
x in a triangle inequality.
Yeah. So we did not prove anything. Okay. We'll prove that. And we did not use anything, any such property also. We just use the definition of norm, okay, everywhere so far. Now we are going to prove that inner product fg has absolute value less than or equal to norm f into norm g. Now, what happens if f for g equal to 0? Suppose f equal to 0. F equal to 0, then what happens? F for g equal to 0, then left hand side as well as right hand side is 0. Okay, that is easy. So now you assume that f for g is non-zero. If f is non-zero, you consider the set f1 equal to f by norm f. This is a singleton set. Can you tell me what is the norm of f1 or f1 inner product with f1? What is f1 inner product with f1?
1.
1. So this is a singleton set. So it is by definition, vacuously it becomes an orthonormal set, right? Since it is norm 1, isn't it? Because what is an orthonormal set? It should be orthogonal to, pairwise orthogonal to each other, and should have norm 1, right? So this is a singleton set, so it is by definition it is orthonormal, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So for orthonormal sets, I can apply Bessel's inequality. What is Bessel's inequality? This one. So instead of n elements, I have only one element. What happens if there is only f1 here? So you don't have any sum here. Simply absolute value of f1g square will be less than or equal to norm g square, right? So let me apply that here. So absolute value of f1g square will be less than or equal to norm g square. Now f1 is by definition f by norm f. So you write f by norm f here. So this is norm f square will come here. So this is mod f g square is less than or equal to norm f square into norm g square. Taking square root, you get the desired inequality. Okay.
Okay,
Now
sir.
the question is, when does equality hold? Okay. So when does equality holds? So equality holds, you just do the backward computation. Okay. So equality holds when equality holds in Bessel's inequality. If you do the backward computation. So what is Bessel's inequality? You have Bessel's inequality here. This is the Bessel's inequality, right? With n equal to 1, equality holds means inner product f1g square is equal to norm g square. Then you go back to the computation, we have this. So you apply this for n equal to 1. Then what happens? Inner product f1g square, absolute value square equal to norm g square. So this quantity and this quantities are equal. That happens exactly when this is 0, isn't it? If these two things are equal, then this should be 0, right?
Yes, sir.
So this is 0 means norm of g minus with n equal to 1 here, inner product f1g f1 should be 0. And by the definition of inner product, you know that that happens exactly when whatever inside this is 0. And inside that, we have g minus inner product f1g f1. That means you have this, yeah, this quantity should be 0. Norm of g minus inner product f1g f1 is 0. That happens when g minus f1g f1 equals 0. That means g is equal to inner product f1g f1. You got it? G is a scalar multiple of f1. Or in other words, g is a scalar multiple of f. Is that clear? So can you tell me when does equality hold? When equality holds?
Equality holds when norm of g minus inner product f1g into f1. That must be turned to 0.
Yeah, that happens when only when whatever inside that is 0, right? I mean,
Yes, sir.
that means what? G is equal to some alpha
G is
into f,
equal to
isn't it? So G is equal to some alpha into f. What is the meaning of that? G is a scalar multiple of R. That means what? It is in a vector space, right? You are in a vector
Yes, sir.
space. One vector is a scalar multiple of the other. What is the meaning of that?
Dependent.
Yeah, they are linearly dependent. So equality holds exactly when you have linear dependence. Okay, so that is the idea. Now we got enough materials to prove that this thing actually a norm. I will come to that. Before that, let me now introduce. So now using this Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, so I already mentioned that my aim is to generalize the geometry which is connected with the dot product. So I generalize the dot product to an inner product. So using that, I can also generalize the notion of angle, right? So from Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, what we have is that you start from f and g non-zero. So mod f by norm, sorry, inner product f by norm f, g by norm g will be less than or equal to 1. Isn't it? For any f and g non-zero, you have this inequality. Okay. Therefore, the real part of this will be lying between -1 and +1, because this is between inside the unit closed unit disk. So this is a complex number in the closed unit disk. So therefore, its real part should be between -1 and 1. So now you consider the function cosine function, cos t. It's a bijection between the intervals 0, pi and -1, 1. So you have an entry, this element is in this interval. So there exists a theta here such that cos theta equal to that real part. Okay. So there exists a unique theta such that cos theta equal to this. And or in other words, theta equal to cosine inverse of whatever you have. So using the inner product, you can introduce the angle theta between any vector f and g, and they are non-zero. Is that clear? This gives us the geometric structure on an inner product space. So this is how do we introduce the geometry using the algebra, generalizing the algebra and obtaining the geometry. Is that clear to all of you? Can I proceed? Any question? Should I explain it further?
Sir, could you please explain this part?
Yeah. So the idea is that, see, if you know A dot B, you know how to define the angle theta between A and B. Like like we did at the beginning. Another A dot B.
Cos inverse.
So we divide A dot B by AB and take the cosine inverse of that. That's the angle
Yes,
between A and B, right?
A and B.
Simply imitating that here. So Cauchy-Schwarz inequality will tell you that this quantity is less than or equal to 1. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
So this is a complex number in the closed unit disk. So definitely its real part should be vary from -1 to 1. So that's what I wrote here. This real part of that will be from -1 to 1. I mean this interval. Now cosine function is a 1, 1 onto function from 0, pi to -1, 1. And you have an element in -1, 1. Therefore, for every element, you have a corresponding theta here such that is equal to cos theta. So this is an element in -1, 1. So there exists a theta in -0, pi such that cos theta equal to this. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that theta is what you define or referred as the angle between f and g. So this is exactly the analog of what we do in the financial dot product, whatever we did with the dot product. For example, when fn theta equal to pi by 2, that means angle is 0. Angle is pi by 2. That means f and g are perpendicular to each other. Then this should be 0. So this part is 0. Okay. So this is the intuition behind we defining inner product fg equals 0 whenever f and g are orthogonal. So shall I proceed further?
Yes, sir.
Now the topological structure. So I mentioned that even though I denote it by norm, I did not prove that it's actually a norm. But now you can easily prove that it's a norm. Because norm f is always greater than or equal to 0. That is, these two properties are trivial because we defined it as inner product ff, right? So inner product ff is always greater than or equal to 0 by definition. And inner product ff equals 0 if and only if f equals 0. So this follows from the definition. Now this triangle inequality is not straightforward. There we make use of Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. You begin with norm f plus g whole square, which is if you use the definition, you will obtain that norm f square plus norm g square plus 2 into real part of fg. That is simply by writing this equal to inner product f plus g and using the linearity and conjugate linearity. Now, the inner product fg, the absolute value itself is bounded by norm f into norm g by Schwarz inequality. So the real part of that will be bounded by norm f into norm g. So this is what we obtain. Okay. Now you look at here. The right hand side is norm f plus norm g all square. This one. So take square root both sides, you obtain norm f plus g less than or equal to norm f plus norm g. Is that clear to all of you? The triangle inequality?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now the other thing is true. Now yesterday, this is something I already mentioned. Now what happened is that every inner product space, every vector space equipped with an inner product is automatically became a normed linear space. Okay. So whatever things which we mentioned regarding norm linear space is also applicable here. So this is called a norm, which I already mentioned. In fact, this behaves like an absolute value, and this will give you a metric. This is something we introduced in the last lecture, that if you have a norm, you have also, or you'll always have a metric, and the corresponding topology is induced by that metric. You can do several things. You can talk about convergence, continuity, and so on. And these properties, the second and third property will imply that this is something which I mentioned yesterday also. Fg going to f plus g and alpha f going to alpha f are continuous functions, okay, with respect to this. And using Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, you will obtain continuity of the inner product also. Because just go back to the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. Look at here. We have this inequality. Now convergence, now this is a norm. So convergence is with respect to this norm. Fn converges to f means norm Fn minus f converges to 0. Gn converges to g means norm Gn minus g converges to 0. So what happens is that when Fn converges to f and Gn converges to g, inner product Fn Gn minus inner product Fg will converge to 0. So that's what we have. So that follows from this inequality. So you can take it as an exercise or something. Okay, so it tells you that inner product is a continuous function. Okay, so the geometric object which we introduced is actually a continuous function. Therefore, what you can do, you can interchange the limit and inner product. You can take out the limit outside the inner product. That's what we are going to see. So now completeness. Okay, yeah. Now completeness. Yesterday we mentioned this. If every Cauchy sequence in a metric space is convergent, we call it a complete metric space. If a normed space is complete with respect to the metric induced by the norm, then we call it a Banach space. Yesterday we mentioned everything. Today we are going to introduce that. You know that every inner product space is a Banach, normed space now. So if an inner product space is complete with respect to the metric induced by the inner product, so that means inner product will give you a norm, and norm will give you a metric. And if that underlying metric space is complete, then we call it a Hilbert space. So is everybody clear with the definition of Hilbert space? Is that okay?
Okay, sir.
Now, let me just notice down this. Yeah, this is a very important thing. We began with metric spaces, right? In fact, every non-empty set you can define some metric, right? So a metric will give you a topological structure, and you can do anything with that, whatever topological things. But the fact is that metric space need not have any algebraic structure in general. For example, closed interval 0, 1, you can make a metric space. Natural number set, you can make a metric space. Singleton set, whatever. You can bring metric anywhere, okay? But you don't expect any algebraic structure there. But in a normed space, we always have an algebraic structure. That means it should be a vector space, first of all. First of all, it should be a vector space. Equipped with it, no. So vector space structure is there as well as a topological structure due to the metric induced by the norm. Also, we have that the metric, the norm which induces the topology is actually compatible with the algebraic operation. What do you mean by that? Because, yeah, this norm f plus g less than or equal to norm f plus g, norm g. That means it is compatible with the addition. And this tells you that norm alpha f is equal to mod alpha into norm f. That means it is compatible with the scalar multiplication. So that is a very important observation. Now in an inner product space, what happens? Addition to all these things, so we already have norm, we have vector space structure, everything, but actually our norm is actually induced by an inner product. And inner product, as I mentioned just before a couple of slides, an inner product will give you a geometric structure due to the angle between some vectors using the inner product. Okay? So inner product space has a rich structure in addition to being an algebraic structure of vector space, being a topology structure introduced by the norm. The norm is actually induced by the geometric property. For example, in Kn or in Cn, for example, there are several norms. Say we introduced P norm, right? There are several norms for P varying from 1 to infinity. There are several norms. But when p equal to 2, there's a speciality. That particular norm is induced by an inner product. Okay, so we have just seen that. So that is why that is of high geometrical importance. Okay, so that's a very special kind of norm. So because that norm has a geometric structure also. Okay, is that clear to all of you? Are you comfortable so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, and as I mentioned that it's an interesting feature of abstract analysis that it is the interplay between various structures on a space. So now these are a couple of results which I mentioned yesterday also. Every finite-dimensional norm linear space is complete, hence it's a Banach space. In particular, every finite-dimensional inner product space is a Hilbert space. Every finite-dimensional inner product space is a Hilbert space. Remember the role played by the finite dimensionality. So finite dimensionality compels the space to be complete. So that is one thing. Similarly, every finite dimensional linear map on a finite dimensional space is continuous. This is something we mentioned yesterday itself. Now another very important thing. In the above results, we get a conclusion based on analytic structure like completeness, continuity. So that is something I mentioned yesterday with an algebraic assumption. Now this is the more important thing. In the setting of a normed space, one can consider infinite series of the form summation ak fk. Yesterday we know that how did we introduce the shorter basis. There we consider the infinite series, right? So infinite linear combination like this can be considered in a normed space. Okay, using the convergence notion with respect to the norm itself. But in an arbitrary vector space, you can only talk about finite linear sum only. Okay, finite linear combinations. So that's a major difference between when you move from a vector space to a normed space. You can talk about something like this. Some convergence criteria comes into picture. Now another thing, you see the continuity and linearity of the inner product. So you look at this inner product G with an infinite linear combination. Now what happens? This is actually limit of the nth part. So can you see this? The inner product G with an infinite linear combination. So the second quantity, you can write it as a limit of the nth partial sum, right? Yes or no? You write it as limit Sn, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So now I already mentioned that this is continuous. I mean, inner product is continuous. So you can take the limit outside. So you take the limit outside, then what remains is a finite linear combination. And using the linearity, that finite linear combination you can take out. Then again apply limit. So you'll obtain like this. So this is possible in an inner product space. You can bring the infinite linear combination outside. Is that clear to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now let us go quickly revisit the examples again. H equal to Zn. So we know that Zn is a Banach space with respect to all the norms we introduced there. But it becomes a Hilbert space only with respect to the norm induced by this inner product. Okay, this will give you the L2 norm. See, ZZ will be summation mod Zj square all power. I mean, ZZ power 1 by 2 means summation mod Zj square all power 1 by 2. So this gives you the L2 norm. So with respect to L2 norm only, this will become a Hilbert space. Otherwise, it is a Banach space only. Now, this is a C00. This is actually an inner product space. We have already seen this, but it is not a Hilbert space because it is not complete. I think that is easy to see. For example, you can consider the sequence Zn equal to 1, 1 by 2, 1 by 3, etc., 1 by n, then 0, 0, 0. This is a sequence in C00. You consider norm Zn minus Zm square. Zn minus Zm will be this. I mean, only terms will be here. 1 by n plus 1, 1 by n plus 2, etc., 1 by m. Rest of them will be 0. If you compute the norm square, this will be this. Okay. Now, this is the, I mean, if you consider summation 1, the series 1 by 1, summation 1 by n square, take the nth partial sum of that and take the Sn minus S sum, then this is exactly coinciding with that. Therefore, this is Cauchy. So Zn is a Cauchy sequence But you can see that it will not converge to any element in X. That is something which we have already observed yesterday. So this will not converge to any element in C00. It will converge to an element in L2, that is 1, 1 by 2, 1 by 3, etc. But that will not, that in other words, C00 will not be closed in L2. That's it. So are you convinced the fact that C00 is not a Hilbert space but an inner product space? Are you convinced?
Yes, sir.
Something we have already proved that all the LP spaces are complete, and this particular space is a Hilbert space because with respect to this inner product space. Okay. Now this is the very interesting example which we discussed maybe in the first or second lecture, second day. C01, we have already seen that it's an inner product space with respect to this inner product, but this will give you the L2 norm here, but with respect to any norm, this will not become integral norm, this will not become complete. This is something we have already seen. Do you recall this? The function? Something
Yes, sir.
in one of the lectures. Okay. So this is also an incomplete inner product space. Yeah, this is the most important Hilbert space, L201. In fact, L2 of E. So yesterday we have seen LP of E, LP spaces, and we have proved that they are all Hilbert space, Banach spaces, right? In particular, if you take P equal to 2, and I'm considering only closed interval 0, 1, but you can deal with any measurable set. So you can define inner product to be this, and this time this becomes a Hilbert space. This is something you have seen, right? L201. And this is the Hilbert space which we will consider later. Okay. Now, you recall that we introduced an inner product on the space of all matrices, but since it's a finite dimensional inner product space, it is already complete and therefore a Hilbert space. Okay. So we have seen several examples and counter examples. Now we are coming close to the end, last side of our lectures. Geometric results, the infinite versions. Now, so let us revisit the results which we already proved. So this is something which I proved for finite sets. So suppose F1, F2, etc. be a countably infinite orthonormal set in X, and G is an arbitrary element in X. X is an inner product space, okay? Then this is something which I proved. You start from J equal to 1 to N, inner product Fj, absolute value square. So do you recall that the proof? We proved it, right? By computing this?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you have this identity, right? Now let me see that. See, this tells you that if you remove this quantity, then this quantity will be less than or equal to this quantity. So summation J equal to 1 to N mod inner product Fj G square will be less than or equal to norm G square for every N. That is very important. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, since it is true for every N, you let N tends to infinity. The right hand side is independent of N. Therefore, you get the very important inequality. This is known as Bessel's inequality. If F1, F2, etc. is a countably infinite orthonormal set in X and G is an arbitrary element, you have this. See, this tells you something more. What does it tell you? The right hand side is norm G square, which is finite. So the left hand side should be finite. That means this sequence Fjg is an L2 sequence, small L2 sequence, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So it's a square summable sequence. So what you obtained is that you start from a countably infinite orthonormal set in X. Then for every G in X will give you an element in small L2. That's the thing. So now the question is, when do you have equality here? When do you have equality here? Suppose you have equality here. Yeah.
Oh.
Do you have a question?
When equality occurs when G and Fn's are independent. So you told.
See, I used Bessel's inequality only for the n equal to 1 case. Okay, n equal to 1 case, what happens is that equality happens only when this is 0, and that will give you linear independence. So that is a part of Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. But here, what happens? Here I am dealing with infinite limit. See, I applied only for n equal to 1, but here I am dealing
Okay,
with.
sir.
So this inequality is
Infinity.
different. So my question is, when do you have equality here? So that means you let n tends to infinity, this should be equal to this. So what should happen? Look at this identity. As n tends to infinity, see, here equality means you have an infinite series converging to this, right? Isn't
Yes,
it?
sir.
So as n tends to infinity, this nth partial sum should converge to this. Then what should happen to this?
That series summation j equal to 1 to infinity fjg, that series must converge to g.
Yeah, that means this quantity should go to 0 as n tends to infinity, right?
Yes.
So that means norm of g minus this nth partial sum should go to 0. Or in other words, equality happens exactly when this quantity goes to 0 as n tends to infinity. So in this identity, what we get is that this happens exactly when this is equal to this. I mean, equality holds means this, right? That happens exactly when this goes to this. That means g equal to this. So do you agree with that? That means equality holds, that means this, if and only if this goes to 0 as n tends to infinity. That means, see, what do you mean by this goes to 0 as n tends to infinity? The nth partial sum converging to this. So that means g equal to this. So equality holds exactly when g is this. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you have this, equality holds exactly when you have this identity. Okay, that is also important. Now let me come back to the discussion. So given an orthonormal set fj in X, Bessel's inequality gives a sequence fjg. This is, so this, whether equality or inequality, this sequence is always in small l2. So this sequence is in small l2 for each g. So this gives you a mapping. For each g, you are getting an element in L2 space, small L2 space. Remember, g is in an arbitrary Hilbert space, inner product space. So for each g, you have an element in L2, small L2. Also, we notice that suppose g is equal to this. Suppose g is equal to this. Then what happens? Let me just compute inner product fkg. G you replace by this because g is assumed to be this. So this. And I have already mentioned that I can take this infinite series outside. So you have this outside and fk fj. But fk fj equal to 0 whenever k not equal to g. So what happens that only j equal to k will survive in this. So when j equal to k, it is fk which is 1, and you will have left with alpha k only. So what happens that fkg is equal to alpha k. That means if g equal to this happens, then this alpha j's should be exactly equal to fjg. Okay? Do you agree with that? Any questions, please?
Clear, sir.
Okay. So you shall interrupt me if you don't get anything. Okay? So what about the converse? Now my question is about the converse. See, we have already seen that you fix an orthonormal set, corresponding to each g, you have an alpha j, I mean a sequence in L2n. The question is, you start from an alpha j in L2n. Can you find a g in X? For that, you need completeness. You can't do it in an arbitrary inner product space, but you need a complete inner product space. That means Hilbert space. So again, you fix an orthonormal set in a Hilbert space H, and you start from an alpha j in L2n. Then summation alpha j fj converges in H, or in other words, this will give you an element in H. Okay? I mean, if you have completeness, I have the reverse process also. I mean, any sequence in L2 will give you an element in the Hilbert space H, provided you fix an orthonormal set there. I mean, alpha fj is fixed. It's an orthonormal set, that's all. So how do you prove that this is an element in H? It's sufficient to show that this series converges, right? So how do you prove that this is convergent? Can you tell me how to prove that it is convergent? I want to prove that a series is infinite series is convergent in X. What is to be done? Come on, tell me. Since I am working in a complete setting, it suffices to show that it's a Cauchy sequence, right? So you take the nth partial sum and show that it is a Cauchy sequence. So this is the nth partial sum, and you compute the Sn minus Sm, and you obtain this only. And does it imply that it's a Cauchy sequence? Can you tell me why it implies that it's a Cauchy sequence?
Belongs to L square.
Come on.
Since alpha j element of L square.
Yeah, alpha j is an element of L to N. Okay, so summation infinite series mode alpha j square is finite. അപ്പോൾ അതെന്തായിരിക്കും അതിന്റെ nth partial sum എന്തായിരിക്കും ഒരു Cauchy sequence ആയിരിക്കും. Okay? Isn't it?
Yes, sir.
അപ്പോൾ അതിന്റെ nth partial sum ന്റെ ഡിഫറൻസ് Sn S minus Sm എടുക്കുമ്പോഴാണ് നമുക്ക് ഇത് കിട്ടുന്നത്. So this tells you that capital Sn is a Cauchy sequence in the Hilbert space H, and therefore it converges. Okay, so we obtained by Rees-Fisher theorem corresponding to each L2n element, you have an element in H, an arbitrary Hilbert space, provided you fix an orthonormal set. Now the thing is that, do we really require completeness there? Can we do the same thing in an incomplete space? Can we do that? In fact, no. Completeness, you cannot drop the completeness assumption. For example, you know that C00 is not complete. You consider En equal to 0, 0, 1, etc. I mean the standard orthonormal set. So this is an orthonormal set. You can easily see that this is an orthonormal set in C00. Now you consider the set 1 by n, n equal to 1 to infinity. This is an L2n sequence. 1 by n is in L2, right? Because summation 1 by n square is finite. So you replace the role of alpha j by 1 by n and replace the role of fj by these ens. Then do you have this is convergent? This is, so what is the series then? Alpha j replaced by 1 by n. So summation 1 by n en. What will be that? That will be 1, 1 by 2, 1 by 3, 1 by and so on, right? But that's not in C00. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So completeness is good. Now the notion of orthonormal basis. See, we have seen that given an orthonormal set Fj in a Hilbert space and a G, you can always find the inner product Fjg, which is an L2 sequence. And hence, this is an L2 sequence, right? Now we are in a Hilbert space. Therefore, corresponding to every L2 sequence, you replace the role of alpha j by this. So summation alpha j fj will become this. Okay, so this will converge, isn't it? That's what we have just seen. Yes or no? You start from you fix an orthonormal set, start from a G, and we have already seen that by Bessel's inequality that fjg is in L2n. Now apply the Rees-Fisher theorem for fjg. Therefore, this will converge. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You denote that limit by G tilde. It's an element in our Hilbert space. Okay. But the thing is that this need not converge to G itself. That means whatever it converges, that need not be G. It will be going to something else, some G tilde. So you can see that we have also proved that this is alpha j. This alpha j will be exactly equal to G tilde, fj G tilde. That means fj G tilde and fj G will be same for all G. But still, it does not imply that G equal to G tilde. I can show you by an example. For example, you consider E2n. I mean, consider the Hilbert space L2n and consider E2n. What is E2n? At the even terms, means we are not taking the whole standard basis, I mean standard orthonormal set. Instead, we take only the even terms. For example, E2, E4, etc. Okay? Did you get me? I mean, what I mean by this E2n?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This is also an orthonormal set. Okay? It's an orthonormal set. Now you take the sequence 1 by n. This is 1 by n is in L2n. Then what happens? Let us form G tilde. What is G tilde now? Summation fjg. So g you take to be 1 by n. This is your g. G is 1 by, g is this sequence 1 by n. So what is fjg? Fj you replace by E2j and E2jg. So E2jg is actually only even terms you will have, then you will obtain this. Summation E2jg, E2j is this. 0, 1 by 2, 0, 1 by 4, etc. That means you are getting some g tilde here, which is not equal to actually your g. Your g is 1 by n. That means your g is 1, 1 by 2, 1 by 3, etc. But your g tilde is this. So this tells you that even though this series converges, it may converge to something else. But here you can see that fjg equal to fjg tilde. That is true for all j. But still g not equal to g tilde. In other words, fj inner product with g tilde minus g equal to 0 for all j does not imply that g tilde minus g equal to 0. So this is the reason. Fj g tilde equal to fjg for all j does not imply that g equal to g tilde. So what happens that orthonormal sets are not enough. You need a maximal orthonormal set, okay, to satisfy this condition. So that means you need this. If fj g tilde equal to fjg for all j, it should imply g equal to g tilde. This condition should be there. So it happens only when fj is a maximal orthonormal set. If fj is maximal, what happens? Fj h tilde equals 0 for all j should imply that h tilde is equal to 0. Okay. So that's what you call, that means anything orthogonal to all the elements is the only 0 element is there. So that is what you call a maximal orthonormal set. So this is the definition. A maximal orthonormal set F alpha in H is called an orthonormal basis. So I introduced orthonormal basis. Is that clear to all of you? What is an orthonormal basis? So this is the third kind of basis I introduced here. Initially I introduced normal basis, then shorter basis, now today orthonormal basis. Now can you tell me if there is any question, or I'm coming to the end of the discussion. So now just tell me, are you convinced with the definition? Are you okay with the definition? It is a maximal orthonormal set. Okay? Is that okay?
Yes, sir. It's okay.
Okay. Now, whenever I introduced basis, whether Hamel basis or shorter basis, I always bothered about its existence, its countability, and so on. Okay? Existence is obvious. Just as we proved the existence of Hamel basis, you can also prove the existence of orthonormal basis. So orthonormal basis exists for every Hilbert space, non-zero Hilbert space. So regarding countability, so we had a problem with Hamel basis because Hamel basis happen to be uncountable most of the time. Here also orthonormal basis can be uncountable, but not always. But there are several interesting examples where you have orthonormal bases are countable. But even though it is uncountable, you have some positive result like this. If F alpha is an orthonormal set in an inner product space X, then for every F belongs to X, this set is always countable. What is this set? The set of all F alpha for which F alpha F inner product F alpha F is non-zero is at most countable. This is a very important result because these quantities, these are going to be the coefficients in our basis expansion. So this is non-zero for at most countably many alpha. That is important. Even though set alpha, F alpha is uncountable, there are only countably many things which we are going to use. So that's what is mentioned by this. Now I am going to consider this. If F alpha is an orthonormal set, now we are not dealing with basis, only a set. F alpha is an orthonormal set in a Hilbert space, and we have already seen that this set is at most countable. F alpha for which inner product F alpha F is non-zero is at most countable. You denote it by F1, F2, etc. Okay, this is countable unit. In this situation, this is a countable orthonormal set, right? Therefore, this will converge because we have already seen that whenever you have an orthonormal set, these coefficients will be in L2, and whenever L2 sequence is there, this series will converge by Riesz-Fisher theorem. So it will converge to some G belongs to H. And what is the specialty of G? That G will satisfy that. Our question is whether it will converge to F itself. That we don't know. This will converge to some G with the property that F minus G will be orthogonal to all alpha, F alpha in this set, orthonormal basis, orthonormal set F alpha, in this orthonormal set. So you have this. This infinite series converges some G with this property, with the property that F alpha F and F alpha G, the inner product, are same for all alpha. So that's what we are getting. Okay, that is simply obtained by applying this Riesz-Fisher theorem to this orthogonal basis and L2 elements. So this is something which we have seen just now, right? Is that okay? Is this result okay to all of you? Any question? Any question there?
Sir, the first part is okay. And F alpha, inner product F alpha F minus G equal to 0 for all alpha element of, for all.
Okay. So
that one.
That is easy. Actually, this converts to some G. That is something trivial, right? I mean, something we have already observed.
Yes.
Now you can write this as G and take inner product with F alpha. I mean, F alpha with G. I mean, so, or you just apply whatever you did here. I mean, yeah. So, yeah, we have this EC. This is what we use. Fj G tilde will be equal to Fj G for all J. Okay. So, this is what we use. So, this means Fj in the product, Fj with G tilde minus G equal to 0. That's what we use. I mean, yeah, that's what we use. So, this is what we have. Is that okay?
Okay, sir.
So now the consequence is that in this situation we have this. This is true for any orthonormal set. But what happens if F alpha is an orthonormal basis? Then this happens only when F equal to G, because F alpha F minus G equals 0 for all alpha will imply that F minus G equals 0, right? Because whenever this is an orthonormal basis, because that is a maximal orthonormal set. So in that situation, in the above, when F alpha is an orthonormal basis for H, then what happens? We have this. F is equal to summation J equal to 1 to infinity Fj Fg. What are these Fj's? They are you start from F and look at the inner product of F with F alpha. There are only countably many non-zero elements. And those Fj's are contributing to this construction. So this is in some sense, this is why F alpha is called an orthonormal basis. Because using maximality, what do you obtain? You have an expression for F like this as an infinite linear combination. Okay. So this also tells you that if you have a countable orthonormal basis, it will be automatically a shorter basis. Every countable orthonormal basis will be automatically a shorter basis because you are getting this expression directly. Is that clear to all of you?
Yes, sir.
So this is known as abstract Fourier expansion. And in this expression, if you take F with the inner product with F and using continuity of the inner product, you will obtain this. This is known as Parseval's relation. So you are also able to compute the norm using this. Remember, the left-hand side is an abstract norm. F is in an arbitrary Hilbert space, and this norm is an abstract norm. But the right-hand side is the L2 norm of the sequence Fjf. So this is very important. Corresponding to each element in F in H, you have an L2 sequence, and it suffices to compute the L2 norm of small L2 norm instead of computing this. So this can be an integral in some sense. I mean, for example, if you are dealing with capital L2 space, this can be integral. This will be an infinite sum. So it suffices to compute an infinite sum instead of computing an integral. So that is the beauty of this result. So now, let me simply explain these examples, but maybe I will give it to you. There are plenty of examples for orthogonal basis. In fact, orthogonal basis can be constructed using something called Gram-Schmidt process. I mean, some of you will be familiar with that. I mean, might be familiar with that. I mean, from any linearly independent set, you can construct using the Gram-Schmidt process, you can construct an orthonormal basis.
Orthonormal basis.
Yeah. So depending on the linear independent set you begin with, you can construct something called orthogonal polynomials. This is the way in which you construct, say, Lipschitz polynomial, then Leschender polynomial, and a lot of examples are there which are of highly practical use. Practically highly useful in solving differential equations and so on. So there are several such orthogonal polynomials and so on, which can be constructed using Gram-Schmidt process. So there are plenty of examples for orthonormal basis, and the standard example in L2n is something which we already discussed. And in L2 minus pi, this is a very important example. You consider fnt equal to e exponential int by square root 2 pi, and where n varying in the set of all integers. Now this is an easy exercise to prove that it's orthonormal set. It is an orthonormal set because inner product fn fm means integral fn fm bar or fn bar fm. That is simply integral exponential m minus n t dt. That is 0 whenever n not equal to m. That is an easy observation. I mean, simply you can compute the integral and obtain. But orthonormal set, proving that it's an orthonormal set is easy. But proving that it's an orthonormal basis, that means it is a maximal orthonormal set, is not that easy. So I did not prove it here. But for the timing, let us assume that. So once it is settled, then you obtain that this is an orthonormal basis, and this is known as the Fourier basis for L2. And now simply use the abstract Fourier series, Fourier expansion we just proved above. That means whenever it is an orthogonal basis, we have this, right? So that tells you that f equal to this, inner product f and f. But what is inner product f and f? Inner product f and f is integral f and f bar. That means, in other words, there will be a minus sign here, which I missed it. So you denoted this by f hat n. This is known as Fourier coefficients. So what we have is f of t is obtained as infinite linear sum of f hat n e raised to int. So look at that. When we introduced the heat conduction problem and vibrating string problem at the beginning, we ended up with such an expression, an infinite series like this, when I mentioned about Fourier series and all. And I mentioned the convergence issues. Now this tells you that this expression holds in L2 minus pi. What is the meaning of this? Can you tell me the meaning of this now?
The function it belongs to L2 minus pi.
Yeah? Louder. It tells you that
We can write it as a
you take the nth partial sum, isn't it? Come on.
f can be written as a limit of.
Yeah, but what limit? That is the question. You can approximate any f by nth partial sum, like infinite series, Fourier series, by its Fourier series. But in what sense? That's the question. Because this convergence happens in L2 minus pi. So this happens in the L2 norm, capital L2 norm, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So this gives you an affirmative answer to the convergence issues of Fourier series within the limitation of L2. So this convergence does not tell you that you have pointwise convergence. It will not guarantee any uniform convergence or anything. It only tells you that you have the Fourier series convergence with respect to the L2 norm, provided f is also in L2. Okay. So this gives you one affirmative answer to that. In fact, yeah. So this is what the approximation is in the L2 sense. That is very, very much important. This is a positive answer, but so this is what I mentioned at the beginning. See, we have to compromise on the convergence notion at some point in time. If you compromise on the convergence notion, it will work for more larger class of functions. Sometimes you have to, so these are the way in which these are the way in which we proceed. So there are divergent Fourier series. I mean, even for continuous functions, the Fourier series need not converge in the usual sense. But this result tells you that you have convergence with respect to L2 sense only. So if you compromise here, you get the convergence. If you compromise on the convergence notion. But if you demand more smoothness on F, then you may obtain a particular, strong type convergence also. For example, if you demand that it is twice differentiable and so on, then you may get pointwise convergence sign. So this has to do with the notion of convergence and smoothness of the function. That is very important. So there are examples of continuous functions with divergent Fourier series. And in this sense, there are several positive as well as negative results. There are counter examples as well as there are positive results. Some means changing the notion of convergence and adding some additional assumptions on the function and so on. So this identity has several practical applications. So that is also important. See, you write it like this. So for example, in signal processing, this is used to retrieve the signal. So I will mention just one thing. So this exponential thing will be stored somewhere. And these Fourier coefficients, F hat n's, these are the things which we will send. Corresponding to a signal, you perform the Fourier transform and send that. So in the signal processing. So if you want to retrieve F, what you do, you consider, this is known as the reconstruction formula for F. So that is an important thing. You treat F as a signal. Any L2 function can be treated as a periodic signal, continuous periodic signal. So to send that signal, instead of sending that signal, you send the Fourier coefficients, F hat n's. So from these Fourier coefficients, you can retrieve these signals. So in fact, there are plenty of applications. Whenever I say for Fourier series, that itself comes from applications. So there are other important class of orthonormal bases, such as orthogonal polynomials, which I mentioned, wavelet basis, and depending on problem, one uses representations with respect to different bases. Now, let me just mention that several important notions in classical analysis were developed to settle the convergence issues of Fourier series. So you may wonder how far it contributed, or how much amount it might have contributed to the development of classical analysis. Simple, see, the idea is that the problem comes from an applied area. Heat conduction problem, vibrating string problem, and so on. And naturally, they ended up with some convergence issues. But the contribution it gave to the classical analysis is something huge. So in a sense, it says that it also went back to the applied area also. So it is a cyclic process. Problem comes from applied area. When we model it, it comes to the mathematics, and it contributes a lot to the mathematical developments and so on, even in the foundation areas like, in the very pure areas like number theory and all, it will contribute there. Then there's a going back to the applied area. Whatever results we obtained here, it was applied in the practical situation scenario and so on. So let me just quote from the book of Fourier series by Rajendra Bhatia. It tells you this: Fourier series are not just tools for physicists and examples for mathematicians. They are directly responsible for the development of nearly one-half of mathematics over the last 2 centuries. So this is something motivated me a lot personally. Let me end this talk. Thank you very much for your patience. In fact, I also wish to mention some of the references. So this is a classical reference. Limaye is known to you, known to most of you. Barry Simon has written a comprehensive course in analysis. There are 5 parts in this textbook. It came very recently, in the last 5 years or something. But it starts from basic real analysis and it ends up with operator theory, operator algebra, spectral theory, and so on. Each thing contains a lot of practical applications, problems, and historical developments, and everything. So this is a very important classic textbooks, a series of textbooks which you should learn. And this is a very small textbook written by Rajendra Bhatia, a very short one, on Fourier series. It discusses a lot of enthusiastic stories. Now, once you learn measure theory, you can deal with, look at Royden real analysis, and of course, a little bit Water-Rudin real and complex analysis. And metric space, you can learn from Water-Rudin and real analysis, basic real analysis. So I'll stop here. Once again, thank you very much for your patience. Any questions?
Sir,
Yeah, please.
sir, doubt is from previous sessions.
Please.
Sir, what is the real difference between the Borel set and Borel sigma algebra?
Borel set and Borel sigma algebra. So any
Yes.
element in the Borel sigma algebra is called a Borel set. That's all. So do you understand Borel sigma algebra?
Yes, sir. But there's a small doubt, not that much clear.
So the idea is simple. You have a topological space, so you have a topology there. That's a collection of subsets. Now that need not be a sigma algebra. So then what do? You look for the sigma algebra containing these sets, the open sets. So you look at the smallest sigma algebra containing this open sets. That is the Borel sigma algebra. And any element in the Borel sigma algebra is called a Borel set. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?